Thanks for the introduction. I'll be talking about lighting design, but from a living systems perspective. But before we dive in, a couple of words on the organization that I work for, which is Signify itself. We're the world leader in lighting, which means number one in connected LED and conventional lighting. We do about 6 billion in sales, or did about 6 billion in sales, and have close to 30,000 people in 70 countries. A couple of numbers here: our reinvestment in R&D, the sales, 20,000 patents, something to be proud of, 28% women in leadership, 35% circular revenues, and so forth. Greater purpose, or our purpose, I would say, is to unlock the extraordinary potential of light for brighter lives and a better world. That's what ties us together here. But on to my presentation, and I speak from a certain extent from a personal perspective as well here. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Lieven Verdin, as was already said. I'm an industrial designer by training, but I prefer to refer to myself as just a designer in the general sense of the word. I'm part of the Signify design team for quite a long time, and proud to say that we're an award-winning design team. We just won 14 IFs and recently 11 red dots. So we're doing quite well there. We're also part of the Circular Design Forum, which is a forum where we share practices and knowledge on circular design. But apart from that, because that's the professional angle, I'm a Belgian. I have a wife and 2 kids, which is important to mention, I think, because they might be running around here in the background. I'm also a musician for a very long time and a co-owner of an own record company where we support independent artists. Apart from that, I'm into baking sourdough bread since COVID. And I am the owner of a pretty large garden, and I happen to be a nature guide as well. Yeah. So why am I saying this? Because I think it's important not to see or not to listen to just a professional, but understand a little bit of the human being that's sitting here in front of you. All right, and then we'll get started. And to get started, I actually want to start with something that's a little bit difficult through an online medium, but we'll try it anyway, because this is how I start these presentations. And I actually want to talk about something that I believe can only be felt or experienced. So it's very hard to convey the information that I have here, but I'll do my best. But I want to try with this, I want to start with this experiment to actually try and feel something. So I'm going to invite all of you, and I'll do the same thing, to close your eyes for a brief second. So I'll do it. I hope you join me. And allow yourself to drift off to a place where you could be totally at ease, where you'd actually want to be if you want to feel calm and at ease. And you could go anywhere in the world. Basically, you can just transport yourself into that place for a second. And the experiment doesn't take long, nothing crazy happens. And now I have a question, very simple question. But before I go there, to anybody who wants to participate, if you have your mobile phone at hand, you can scan this barcode and it will take you to menti.com, where you'll see the question, or you just surf to menti.com and you provide the code that you see here, and then you can answer the question that I'm about to ask. So if you did this, my question is, like, what most resembles where you were? Were you somewhere inside in a built environment, a confined space that we created? Or did it resemble more something like this, where you are outside in a more natural environment? And I hope all of you found their way to Menti. If not, we're going to see it immediately, but I see that that's working. So I'll give it a couple of seconds. see how that goes. It's kind of like an organic or like a living system itself. All right, it's growing a little bit. So for those of you who only just joined, that's going to be a little bit difficult, but I think you get the gist of this. Don't worry if you didn't make it here, if you didn't make it to menti.com. It's not a problem at all. But basically what this shows, and it confirms something, back in the 80s, Edward Wilson talked about biophilia. He suggested that we humans have this innate tendency to seek connection with nature and other forms of life, because that's we have this innate capacity to be drawn naturally to what is nature, and that is what we call biophilia. And that's actually what I meant with the gist of my whole presentation. I could actually stop here because that's the point that I'm going to try and make today. We're part of this. It's close to our own nature. But let's go. I'm going to try and give you another angle. I'm going to start off from the moment that I was very young, around 1984. I was devouring this book, The Wonders of Life, with these beautiful illustrations from Charlie Harper. And I was so interested in everything that was going on in that book, everything that was teaching me about life, insects, because I had this huge interest. But at the same time, I was sparked by the beautiful illustrations that it had. And it's kind of like that interest grew stronger and stronger during my education. And it, in the end, brought me to become a designer, an industrial designer. So I worked on a variety of projects during my career, while my interest of nature dropped to the background. So I've worked in public environments, like look at the Zaal for the Flemish Parliament when I was working at Stefan Schöning's studio, also some public environment projects there. But the vast part of my career has been in lighting, in designing lighting solutions. And I'll take you through a couple of these things because I've always felt this urge to not just to design something that is commercially interesting, but always was thinking about this idea of perceived obsolescence. Like, how can I design something that will remain relevant through the length of time, right? Even if I had designed it 20 years ago, would it still be relevant today, which is a difficult exercise. And this is one of those examples, the runner spotlight, which I designed a long time ago, which is still a high running product, even in the current portfolio today, just to show that it is possible, although it is a very simple thing, of course, and that's where it lies. Similar thing is the knickknack, for example. I think I designed it around 2010, which is just reduced to its minimum, but then try to put in something that gives it character in the way that it could move, or that it could articulate itself, thus becoming expressive, thus like being able to provide some sort of emotional durability. Like, you like it or you don't, and if you like it, you want to hold on to this design. That's the idea behind that. So it's very product oriented. And then around that time, I also became more interested in the experience of light itself, whereas initially it was more product oriented. And then I started thinking about this whole complexity of light being both a particle and a wave. And I was seeking ways of how can I actually have the design tell a story about that. And with the advent of LED technology, I tried to think about, like, how can I let that object tell you that it's something that you almost can't grasp. So in this case, it's like there's this classical form, but it doesn't have a light source. And yet when you turn it on, it's emitting light. Like, how can that happen? So it was that duality that I was trying to incorporate. And Ecological is also a design like that, where you have a strong narrative about we're trying to capture the idea of light, but you can't really grasp it because it's intangible. You can compress it to nothing, basically. Then Hue came along, Philips Hue, around 2012. And the interesting was here is that you have an electronic light source, a LED light source. And what you did is when you have multiple of those, you add a brain to that system, which is the Hue bridge, and you create this network of light sources or light points that can talk to each other, that can communicate, can behave together like a network. Like one of the first moments where I start to see comparisons with, hey, this is kind of like how a living system behaves, so that's interesting. But the next thing was like next to what I was trying to seek after, like this emotional durability and design. Interesting thing about a proposition like you is that it grows more valuable over time. The same product can do more the next year, the next year, the next year, right? You don't have to buy anything new, where in the beginning we could do scenes. The same lights today can have you wake up or go to sleep. Now they've become motion aware. Just recently we introduced spatial awareness, making it even more richer how that light maps throughout a room. So it's interesting how you get more value out of the same product over time. So it becomes more capable, more complex, which is a very interesting thought. But back at the time when we were starting to design for you, going from bulbs to luminaires, one of the first things we did was the Hue Go. And that's something where we thought like, okay, we can now make a light source portable because it didn't need that much of energy. And so we thought about like, what does that imply? So we just tried to make an object that was 100% about light so that you could pick it up and just carry around light wherever you wanted to have it. So very interesting things that were changing there as opposed to what we could do with conventional lighting. And then when I talk about you have to talk about experience design and digital design as well. So that actually brought me into the broader realm of experience or user experience design and digital design. And I moved to the professional portfolio where I looked at the migration from a Philips software portfolio to the Interact portfolio, meaning lighting controls, lighting commissioning. And there, the idea of service and systemic design popped up for the first time. That was like first time I became conscious of these terms because I had to deal with so many different stakeholders, both internally as well as externally, installers, owners of these installation companies, the architects, the municipalities, the customers, the ones who are buying the lighting system, the end users, people like you and me who are exposed to this lighting. And then in a variety of different domains, like whether that's a city or a retailer or a sports arena or an office building or a landmark and go on. So it's such a complex portfolio that you have to think in this or have to start thinking in this systemic way about what does this all imply for each and individual product and system or service that we're actually trying to create. So that was an interesting change for me as an industrial designer. But I went back to product design, and around that time, Nature Connect was surfacing, and two colleagues of mine, Paul Thursfield and Ramon van de Ven, at the time, they formulated design principles for natural lighting from our experience and research. So what makes lighting, what makes artificial lighting create or give that impression of the fact that it is natural lighting, so that me, my body, my brain actually perceive this as something natural and have that biophilic effect. And I thought that was so interesting. We were working on well-being propositions for you. So I took those principles for natural lighting. I started thinking about the bedroom, because sleep and your regulation, your circadian rhythm is so important there. And started to think about like what could this mean. So we were sketching just these very basic visual representations of like, could it be gradient? Can it come from one single thing? Is it automated? If it's in my vicinity, can I control it? And then if that's the case, like what's the relationship to the other lighting that might be in the room? How do we do that? How does the light gradually move up from the bottom, like the sun that's rises into my main lighting and draw back in the evening, for instance? Like, how do we do that? What do we need to build for all these things? In the end, this ended up in this product, which I'll come back to a little later, which is the Hue Twilight, which we introduced in 24, where you can see this vertical gradient, so where we emulate basically real sunrises. But at the same time, this one came back to me, the knickknack, which I mentioned in the beginning. So around 2020, when I was working on these concepts, I was also getting some emails from a couple of architects or interior designers who bought this luminaire 10 years ago and were now having trouble because the component like a PSU or a driver would break down. It wasn't really clear for them like how to fix this. And then somewhere on the internet, they would find my name attached to this product, and they were directly addressing me because they loved the product so much that they wanted to keep it in use, but they couldn't really figure out like what it is that they needed. And it's not that it wasn't repairable, when it was just hard to do, but it got me thinking like, I should be able to do a better job at that, right? It's not just about the design, and it's not just bind whomever uses it or buys into it emotionally to it. But I also have a responsibility because like I help putting these things in the market, and you actually want to use them for as long as possible if that was the initial goal. So like, should I be proud about these things or not? It puzzled me a lot. Around the same time, I'm pausing here a little bit, around 2020, we also moved from the city of Antwerp into more rural location in Belgium. And I was lucky enough to have quite a large garden for Belgian standards. And we made a decision quite early on to approach this garden in a permaculture sense. So we were actually looking at like, how can we stimulate biodiversity here rather than imagine the garden that we want and just let that dictate whatever the garden is that we will be creating or that we will be getting. And since I was a bit of a city boy, that was not an easy nut to crack. So in the beginning, it was total chaos because I didn't really understand what was going on. But gradually over time, the chaos turned into patterns and connections that I could see. So for example, on the left here in the picture, you see an elderflower tree. And something that I noticed was every year at the beginning of spring, when this tree would start to blossom, it would attract aphids. So it would be one of the first plants to be covered in aphids. And I felt like, oh no, this tree is probably going to die. And then later on, I would see it on the fruit trees. And I would look at biological means to actually fight those aphids, not with insecticides, but trying to figure out what can I do with that. But later on, I started to understand like this is a returning phenomenon actually, and the tree lives, like it's not dying out. And turns out that an elderflower actually does that. Like it does attract aphids early on as one of the first. But what it also does as a consequence is actually it's attracting predating insects like wasps and what have you into my garden because the aphids are there and they predate on those aphids. So it's actually kind of prepping my garden and the fruit trees that I have somewhere else, because I'm getting these insects in my garden that will actually fight these aphids for me once they spread out. So understanding those relationships and see those patterns emerge was interesting and something I became more aware of. Same thing goes for relationships at large that you start to understand. For instance, this European oak tree that sits in the garden here, compared to a American oak tree, for instance, which you see here often. An American oak tree has about 40 relationships here in Europe with other species that it can house, feed, and so forth. But the European oak tree has about 400 direct relationships with birds and insects, bacteria, with fungal partners, and so forth. So it's amazing, like how this web is connected and works together. Another thing that struck me, because in the beginning my thinking was like, me as a human being, I shouldn't intervene that much in this garden. Like, probably it's best to let it just be and evolve the way it is. But then at the same time, I learned like, actually, if you do intervene and if you prune, well, there's actually more that you can create. Like there would actually, a fruit tree would actually thrive if I would actually intervene in that tree, which was a kind of like a weird concept for me, because if you think about the human condition and you think about how we intervene in the planet, you tend to think like nothing good comes of that. But actually, it's the first time that I saw like, well, an intervention can actually lead to more, into something better, into for something living to thrive. So it kind of like changed my view on what we are as humans, and make me think about the fact that there's a way of viewing ourselves as a keystone species. Like if we intervene in the right way, you actually have this cascading effect, maybe more than other species. Another principle, and I'll make the link to lighting in a second, so don't worry about that if you think we're driving off here. Everything serves multiple purposes. Like if you start looking at things like how this works, and that's a permacultural principle that you start to use also. So instead of building a fence or taking in resources from somewhere else, you just build with what your garden produces, or like in this case, branches. Every year I've got loads of branches and debris. So you just start building fences with that. And it's not just a fence, because it's also shelter for insects, it's shelter for birds or rodents. It's creating a shadow on one hand side of that fence, whereas it's warmer on the other hand side. So you're making these micro ecosystems on both sides of that fence. At the same time, it's composting, so it's actually generating better soil over time. Super interesting to then look at everything and think how like it's amazing how everything serves multiple purposes. And one of those is obviously there's just no concept of waste. Nothing gets wasted. Everything gets cycled back into the system, and not just in a way that it is sustainable. So sustainability doesn't mean anything in that sense. That's just a human construct. Basically, it's a status quo somewhere in time when you look at it. But it does that. It circulates everything in a way that is conducive to life. So it's regenerative. It's actually always creating more life, and my soil is getting richer and more plants can grow, and so forth and so forth. So it's very interesting principle. But to make it tangible, and at that time I was working on the Hue Twilight, I just took that concept of no waste and took it seriously, and think about like, what does this now imply for a design like this? Like, what does it mean? What are we doing with other designs, or what have I been doing with other designs that's actually easy to fix? So a couple of examples. I started looking at the base of the luminaire, which is aluminium. So why would I actually paint it? Because it's the base, and the aluminium as inherent beauty. So why not just leave it bare? And instead of stickering it, why shouldn't we just laser it so that it's just pure material, so that if it reaches its end of life, it can just cycle back into as a pure form into the material waste stream. The same goes for the plastic housing. A lot of times you see electronic products. It's a bit shocking actually, but a lot of time these products get painted just to achieve the high level of surface quality and look and feel that is required in the consumer domain. But we just said here from the get-go, because we tried it before, but we never achieved doing so. But here we said, like, if we can't fix this in mass without paint, we're just not going to release the black color. So it was actually, for the whole team, it was more a clear effort to really achieve that. So it took us a while together with the supplier to work on this and really design everything out, or really fix everything. But we managed in the end, and the black product is on the market without any paint, keeping the polycarbonate pure. And then on the left-hand side, you see these cork rings, which is interesting because typically you would use felt or rubber like you see on the right-hand side. But here I suggested, like, why don't we go for cork, because it has this inherent aesthetic property, but it also has these friction properties, and it's water repellent, and it just attaches through its vacuum property. You don't have to have a snap, you don't need to use glue or anything. So again, it's just a pure material part that will come apart whenever this thing reaches its end of life and can go into the waste stream. Similar as we did on the bridge, for instance, the new Bridge Pro. Instead of gluing these things, or instead of permanently attaching it, just use the properties of the material, snap it in, fix a couple of obvious things. So much of this work was focused on like the end of life actually of a product, just to make sure that what goes out can potentially, I'm not saying it does, but can potentially flow back into material recuperation streams. But at the same time, you start thinking about, but what goes in? Like, where does this PC come from? Where does this aluminium come from? What other materials am I using? Like the cork as an alternative to polyester felt. And actually, then, like, if the material makes it out of the waste stream, like, how does it get back in? Is it actually getting back in? Is the PC recycled now that we managed to actually not paint it? And are we reusing it? So all these questions start to pop up. Of course, the use phase, which is dominant if you talk about energy use. And obviously, man, it has a purpose. It has a purpose for humans, so it has a positive effect. But inevitably, there are consequences of this that might have negative effects. Like, what are those? Do I understand those? Do I understand maybe misuse of the product? And looking closer at it, like, probably this is where you want to go to. Like, the use phase is so dominant, and then you would want more positive effects of the use phase of the lighting, reduce the negative effects of it that potentially are there, make sure those waste streams flow back in, use as less material as possible to actually facilitate that use phase. And if the waste stream can't be reused, like, what else is it good for? Like, what could it? So a lot of questions started to pop up, and I was starting to do experiments or studies basically on existing products to understand, like, what if I redesign it? What if I make an alternative concept? Like, how can I reduce the impact? Just like, for instance, the carbon footprint, which is just a snapshot, of course. And surely if you start studying this, you would see, like, oh, okay, like, with a couple of interventions, I could even reduce it by 70% just by rethinking the whole proposition, which is interesting, of course. But that's not enough, because then you're focusing on one thing. So I started building these life cycle maps of products, where here you see on the top side, I took LCA data. But at the bottom side, I just started talking to people in the value chain just to understand, like, what happens here. Do we have any problems? Do you see inefficiencies or whatever it is? So look at all these phases and just started collecting data to understand, like, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And then where should I intervene? And sure enough, you will find hotspots to focus on, but it's a lot. And before you know it, things start to look like this, where you just think, like, where should I start? Because there's so much to address. There's so much that I can do. So again, like, you end up with this complex chaos. And this drawing I have here is actually based on something that I saw in a presentation from Chris Bryant, who heads design at Cooper Lighting, when he was talking about the design process as being a messy process, not as structured as methodologic as we often like to believe. And it very much resonated with me, because I know the double diamonds, I know the structure, we all know design thinking and design doing by now, but often, like, this feels more like my natural process. And looking at this, like, I couldn't help but thinking about, this is kind of like what I was experiencing in the garden at first. It's just, there's so much to grasp, so much to understand, or maybe not to understand, but just to accept that complex chaos that in the end, if you allow it to be there and you take the time and you step back, you would gradually see these relationships and patterns emerge. And sure enough, you don't just let it happen. Sure enough, there are tools and ways of doing that. So gradually, I started to accept, like, hey, like, the fact that I'm not so methodologic and more intuitive in my design process, like, I have done successful products, so there must be something right about that, and it actually feels really natural to me. So why have I always felt inconfident about that approach? Like, why is it so weird to say that it is chaotic and complex? And this brings me to this person right here. I don't know if you recognized him, because I used a bit of AI to reconstruct him. But here we have René Descartes. And Descartes, he introduced the Cartesian, from Descartes, Cartesian divide or Cartesian dualism. So he introduced this idea of separation between mind and matter, which created this idea of human exceptionalism, right? And we could see the whole world as matter. Nature is matter, our bodies is matter, the planets, it's all matter, and we're separated from that because we have a mind, the capacity to think, to be conscious. And that started or was at the forefront of the Enlightenment, which sparked great ideas and great advances in science. And one of you, which you will all know, or which we all know, is Sir Isaac Newton, because he took those principles and he turned them basically into something very pragmatic. So he said, like, okay, if the world is matter, well, then we should be able to reduce it to very simple universal principles, reduce it to the smallest parts and understand how those parts work together, and then we understand the world. And I mean, certain enough, everybody knows that this has led to major breakthroughs in science and also in lighting, because Isaac Newton was one of the first to understand that lighting is made of can be seen as a bunch of particles, and therefore explain how reflection and refraction works. So yeah, the pinnacle of that time, the technological mega feature was a clockwork. So that kind of like resembles the thinking, like you could see the universe as this giant machine of individual parts that works together. You study that and understand how that works. Now, this is a very powerful way of thinking, but it does have its limitations. For instance, if I would have a ball here and I would lay it, I would run at it and kick it, or whatever, I could perfectly. Newton does have many fingers, I see here in the chat, that's true. And if I would kick that ball, I could, with Newtonian principles, I could perfectly calculate like what would happen to that ball. Like I know my speed, the angle of which I would kick it, so the momentum, the impact, the point where I would impact it, the weight, the mass of my leg, and so forth and so forth. So I could perfectly predict the world, what would happen there. But if I would simply swap that ball and I would take a dog, for instance, regardless of the moral idea of this example, but if I would take a dog there and I would run at that dog and would try to kick that dog, I could take the same principles and probably calculate like what would happen if I would kick that dog. But everybody knows that that is not what's going to happen, because that dog is a living thing. And it's going to respond based on its character, based on its previous experience, whatever, based on whether it saw me or whether it did not perceive me, whatever. So it doesn't, the Newtonian principles or the mechanistic reductionism that was introduced doesn't explain fully how the world works. So it's not that it's not usable, because it's good for a lot of science, but it doesn't fully grasp or can't fully capture how the living world behaves or a living system behaves. Yet, even though that in the 1920s systems thinking emerged, and it has led to features like the actual technology that I'm using today to talk to you, or the AI that I use to generate a Newton with 15 fingers, even though that has emerged and has made many things possible for us, that's not how we think, because we're still trained to think according to those mechanist principles. At least in Western culture, we are. So we're trained to think in narrow boundaries, to make things very, very small, and then to address whatever it is, and even think in problems. And it has rendered us to be specialists in our own field. And as I was introducing myself, I'm an industrial designer, right? So we tend to narrow things down, and we're not fully aware of the fact that this is so ingrained in the way that we are trained. And we have to become aware of that, right? I'm starting to become aware of that. And it's not only the fact that we're trained to think like this, we're also taught to speak in the same manner, because that's how our Western language evolved. We don't think in terms of holism or speak in terms of holism, but we speak in terms of separation. Just like we reduce everything to the simplest parts, we try to objectify our world and separate one thing from another, try to look at things as a single entity. Interesting to become aware of. So if I would pop up this picture again of the tree that I see standing in my garden, I would ask, like, what do I see? Well, initially I saw a tree, right? You see a tree, you see branches, you can describe it has leaves and so forth, but we're just describing parts basically. And if we do that, then it's not so difficult to see that as resources also, or as lumber, or as wood that I can use in something. But if I would look at, for instance, native languages or indigenous language, let's take North American native language. I'm not saying it's fully correct, but there's a lot of animacy in there. So they would probably say something more like whereas I would say I'm going to sit under the tree, they would say I'm going to be with one of the standing people, right? So they would look at this thing in a completely different way, and you see how that immediately influences the relationship we have with this thing that we see and call a tree. Whereas if you just reframe it and understand that it's a living thing or a being that has all these relationships, your relationship changes as well. Right? So it would be harder actually to think of it as just something that I'm going to harvest and use as a resource. So that said, on to another example, which I really love, which is, again, I would have to ask, like, if you were an audience that I could talk to right now, I would ask you, like, what do you see here? This is a lichen. And in Dutch, we would say this is korstmos. I love the word because it kind of like sounds like cosmos, but korstmos, so it kind of implies that it's a moss. I don't know if it has the same implication in English when you talk about a lichen, but the key thing is here, like, we look at something and we see a thing, we see one thing, and we give it a name, and that's what it is. But that's not reality. That's our constructed world, right? That's how we perceive and describe the world. Because actually what we see here is, on one hand, an algal partner, and on the other hand, a fungal partner. So this is actually two things, two organisms that are working together to form this lichen. So I mean, it isn't one thing. The algae that are in there, they do photosynthesis, but they could have never left the water because they need water. And it could not just simply be exposed to the sunlight and to UV. So they bonded, or they formed this coalition with a fungal partner that cannot produce its own food. So it has this benefit of working together with the algae because they can do photosynthesis, but at the same time, they would provide protection for the algae to come out of the water and keep them moist and protect them from UV sunlight. So they form this symbiotic relationship into something new, like a more complex organism or a more complex life form. And this is not about competition. This is about symbiosis driving evolution here. And an interesting thing I think here is that notion that this is one of the first steps of water, of life leaving water and making it to land. And I'm going to take a slight detour here to this book from Zoe Schlanger, which she called the light eaters. I also thought the framing was interesting because she doesn't say like, hey, here's the latest science on plants. No, I mean, here's the light eaters, because that's what they do. They take extraterrestrial light, solar energy, and they turn it into something new. And with that, they can generate something else. And just the term, like, I was wondering, like, why is this so attractive to me, the word the light eaters, next to the fact that you reframe it? And I remembered that I read this article on where James Turrell was talking about the rodent crater. He said that he was using light as this elixir that we drink, as vitamin D through the skin. So he literally then said like we are literally light eaters. So I was making this relationship with uh, people as well, because we do a similar thing. It's not that we do photosynthesis, but we need it as well. Um, Interesting. So interesting side to here. So if I come back to this, the main idea here is that um, something almost magical is happening, I think, right? So this is a cooperative, symbiotic being that's initially using light as an energy source. And what it's actually doing by that, by this symbiosis, by this collaboration, it's generating conditions for other life to thrive, because it made its way to land. This is how it could live on land, on rocks, or what have you. But when it would decay, it would start to become the soil, right, of something new for a vast biodiversity of plant life to emerge. Plant life giving birth to other forms of life, like insects, mammals, what have you, that could actually thrive on that abundance of plant life. So it's a key step in the evolutionary process that we have this symbiotic relationship. So it's next time you go outside, and you can do it just today, like you see this everywhere, right? These lichen. So it's very interesting, and you can look at that and start thinking about that for a second. And I'm turning this to myself, because if I'm working in my garden and I look at my hands, and this is my hands, it always gets dirty, obviously. So I can't help but thinking of like, so what does this imply? Because like every time I work here, I'm getting material, bacteria, what is it, whatever organisms, they're like on me. So I take them in. What if I eat an apple that is in my garden? I'm taking up its molecular structure. So those molecules, they enter me. When does that apple become me? Or when am I still the apple? And here I'm getting a little bit philosophical, but you can like destruct this or deconstruct this whole entanglement, and then you can't draw any boundaries anymore. You see this total connectedness. So I would dare to state that as a species, there's nothing exceptional about us. We have this inseparable entanglement with anything that's living, or with everything that is living. And you could take that a step further, and I'm going to go back, or I'm going to stick in 2020 again for a second, because also in 2020, I read this report in Nature that indicated, and I don't like to toss around numbers, but this is the only one that I'll really do. In 2020, um, I learned that the whole man-made constructed world of, let's say, dead matter has outweighed the whole of the biomass that we have on planet Earth. So as of 2020, there's actually more stuff created than there is living biomass. Yet, think about this, because even though it's hard to see, none of the stuff on the left-hand side could have been created or could have been realized without having a living planet. Everything that we have there, you can tie back in some kind of way to whatever we have. I generated this picture sometime with AI, and I didn't do a really good job at it, so it's totally flawed. But if you would take an example of something material, like one of the luminaires that I design, the plastics in there, the metals in there, what have you, the energy that we use, you can all relate that, well, not the metals, but the plastics, you can all relate that back to fossil energy. Fossil energy, what is that? Those are algae or swamps that have photosynthesized and have laid there for, what is it, 100 to 400 million years to actually turn into that fossil energy. And then we use it and we turn it into something new. So again, here, the example was easier to be made with myself, but the same goes for everything that we produce. And in a sense, it's inseparably entangled. So none of that can be created without a living world. And now I'm going to make a jump here, because if I think about this living world, it's very diverse currently. So we have gigantic biodiversity. But of all the species that have ever lived on planet Earth, reality is that 99.9% of all those species are estimated to have gone extinct. That also means that the biodiversity that we have today, that's 0.1%, and that's still there. That 0.1% that managed to stick around or to evolve, all engage in some sort of reciprocal relationship to other species and other organisms. There's a constant exchange of matter and energy between these living organisms in such a way that it's conducive to life, that it's ever creating more life. And then the question to me is, since we're inseparably entangled, we're a part of that as well. Like, do we fit in with that 0.1%, or are we likely to become one of the 99.9% that do not behave according to these patterns of life? So if I relate that back to the work that I do, then no doubt in my mind, there's no doubt in my mind that one of the things that we need to do is go for circularity. Whatever we do must be circular, because that's just the way matter and energy move through a living system. So we shouldn't even debate that. That is what we should be doing. But the thing that puzzles me, this is already difficult, don't get me wrong. And we've worked hard already in the past few years, and we've just recently announced our new Brighter Lives, Better World strategy. And I'm happy to say that in there, we now have a pillar that talks about circularity, and we created a framework for that. So we talk about using less, longer, and again. But I'm not going to dwell on that. We'll have better presentations on that. The thing that puzzles me as a designer is, how do you go from just circulating whatever that is, because that would be a status quo, to that regenerative aspect of life, right? Where you not just participate, but where you actually participate in such a sense that you're conducive to life. Like, what does that mean when you're creating something artificial, when we're designing something, when we're intervening? This is a tough question, but I think that is the question to ask and to be mindful about. And even though, like, we've come a long way to become human-centric in design, and it's still sometimes a battle, I would say. I do think you can't be really human-centric if we know all this, then by looking beyond the humans that we are. So I think if you want to be truly human-centric, you have to be life or ecocentric. And through that, if you serve the greater life or the ecosystems, whatever, all the relationships, through that you serve humans as well. So what does that imply when you then engage in a project, or when you have to design something? And I understand, like, I'm engaging it from the point of view as an industrial designer, and probably in the audience we'll have many people who work in a different kind of context, who are lighting designers, or lighting application designers, lighting applied in a real context. So we're not thinking about how to manufacture and create a product, but how to use those products in a real life context. I think that the question is the same. It's not so different. So where conventional brief would ask, if I were to intervene, like, what is this place that I'm designing for? Who is using it? Why and how are we going to illuminate it? Or for what experience are we going to illuminate it? What is it that we're trying to achieve? Like, all good questions, but currently it's still like an anthropocentric boundary. We're still focusing on the human in there way too much. So a live ecocentric brief would ask a different thing, right? It's not going to start from that point, and it's going to ask a question along the lines of, how can light participate in the health and rhythm of the system that's at play at this place or location or region or whatever that I'm designing for? And how does this intervention that I'm going to be doing affect the whole network of life that's interacting there? So that's a a huge boundary. That's wide boundary thinking, living systems thinking, thinking of what actually happens there. And if I then look back at my own work, I have to realize that that even though there were elements, I wasn't able yet to ask myself these questions. So if I look back, like I was wondering about this, the twilight, because the images that I generated when I was designing it are different, for example, than the images that we use in marketing. And I was wondering, like, why do I prefer the images that I've created? Like, what was I trying to tell that I apparently didn't tell? And it's actually that in this design, like I had this inherent intent to actually restore relationship with darkness through this design and natural rhythm. Natural rhythm is obvious, but even to allow darkness be part of the experience that I created through creating artificial lighting. So that's a bit puzzling. Would I do that differently if I had the same assignment today? For sure, right? Because I would look at a lot of different aspects and I would push the boundaries of what we're doing. But still, it's not always just about the material or the light effect in itself. Like there's so many layers that we can think of how this thing can have an interaction with who it is using and trigger different thoughts or seeing systems, relations, or connections to other things, like make you maybe more mindful of the fact that darkness is important, actually. And moving on from that, like, why is it important to ask that question? Because I could also say like circularity is good enough, but I have to ask the question because lighting is a hub amplifier if you think of systems theory. So that means that wherever we introduce lighting, we're actually also introducing human activity and we're allowing human activity to expand. So thanks to lighting, there's more that can happen in a certain location. So we have to be very mindful about what we're actually triggering and what we're doing. So I see 3 strategies if you take this whole idea of living systems thinking and life and ecocentric design. Strategies or pathways, if you will. Like there's design by emission. That actually means like it's perfectly fine to decide or choose not to intervene with lighting or to not design a certain luminaire. That's actually an active choice as well, because you choose not to intervene with the systems that are already interacting. Second pathway is to consider sufficiency, where you become conscious of we're introducing something because there is a need. And I'm not ignoring that there are human needs that require artificial lighting for activity to take place. But what is sufficient? And we've seen many examples also here in the Lighting Academy webinars that actually we see experiments where we reduce the amount of lighting in cities or in whole regions, and we see that it works, and we see that safety isn't affected, that it's actually okay. So there's a lot to be still explored on the level of design by sufficiency. And then the third is design by participation. And what that is, that I mean that we become more conscious of the capacities that we design into the luminaires and the systems that we create, so that they become more participants of the systems that they are embedded in, that they respond to more than just us humans, but that they can respond to whatever the interactions are that take place, the fauna, the flora, what have you. So that's definitely a case for the smartness that we can embed in LED lighting if we do that consciously. So here's a thing that hampers me a little bit, or that limits me as an industrial designer to design or life and ecocentric. I can imagine what I'm designing for, but it's always like a generic context. I never know when I design, for instance, this luminaire here. I don't know on which bedside table it's going to end up, or in what part of the world it's going to end up. So I have to take these assumptions about what that's going to be. but I can take in mind like what the consequences that will be in a bigger context, not just the experience that I'm trying to create and not just the people that are going to use it, but I can think about the economic and social cultural context. I can think about impact on flora, fauna, what have you, but in a generic sense. And this is where, uh, or, or this is what I can contribute. Like I can design it in such a way that it is ready to be circular, right? And output products and services according to that principle. But I'm also relying on the fact that there's other people who will take those things and use them, or who will design and specify the use of those luminaires and lighting solutions in a specific context. So there's an invitation there to start thinking in a similar way, or to reframe your thinking and your briefs, to think about the system that's at play in that context, and then use those products that we have designed in a conscious way, and vice versa, to ask questions or to feedback things to us to understand, like, hey, we need different kinds of solutions because this is the reality. This is how our systems and products intervene in a specific context. Can you not design things differently? Because that would actually help us to design better applications in those contexts. So that's like, it requires everybody to be in on this, not just me as an industrial designer trying to push that boundary open. So what is this about? Dive into context, understand a certain context, live it, and live it, understand the system that you're intervening in. Try and see the connectedness and the relationships that are at play there to understand what you're intervening in. And then think in those systems, and not just that system, but try to think in the nestedness, like, because that system is embedded in a larger system, which you can take away all the way up to the planet. And rather than me offering you a very specific tool on how to do that, and there's lots to be found on how you start to practice system thinking, I think the key message, or the key gift that I can give in that sense, is just to say to everybody here, is the way you do that is to just go out, to pause, to take the time, and to observe what is happening wherever you are. Living world, I mean. Well, even if you're in a city, like, there's life everywhere. But to do that, not just to go out and be in nature, walk around, but really to pause and observe and try to understand, like, what is actually dynamically happening here. Because we can experience that anywhere, and that can change our thinking. And maybe if you're lucky, and just recently I was lucky enough to do so, maybe you're able to enjoy a night sky. And when you then look up and do that, like, it's really not hard to think, if you're looking at this, and wonder, like, but who you are in context of this greater whole, because that's, for me, that's really what a night does. So let's cherish that. And that is the end of my story.